Well, I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Stan Tenen, and I work for the Meru Foundation. No one should believe what I'm saying. It's not that I'm telling you anything I don't think is so. It's just that you really need to be skeptical about this sort of thing. This is work in progress. It's an honest research. I speak quickly, and I may say "is" when I mean based on the models and based on the references, it's my best conjecture that this is. So I'm not saying absolute truth when I say "is." I'm just trying to fit things into a short time period. This is very controversial material because, in the words of a friendly scholar, it can't be so. And what, of course, he means is that if it is so, then there's a lot of readjustment to make. And I try to explain to people that this really doesn't say anything like I'm right and you're all wrong. It says rather that this is a deeper level that integrates a whole range of material, and it demonstrates mostly that what the scholars have been saying and what the religious people have been saying and what the different religious people have been saying, they've all been right, but in their own contexts. And that if you go deeper, then you find something more common. Well, my eyes fell on the sequence of letters at the beginning of Genesis. And all of the old programs in my brain from the math team class went off and said, this is crazy. This isn't language. This is a pattern. Somebody made a puzzle here. Well, I discussed this on the air. I put the beginning of Genesis on the TV screen live in San Francisco, but I wrote the text out numerically. I replaced the letters with the numbers. A is 1, B is 2, C is 3. The standard numerological gematria values that are associated with the Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic letters. And I told people it was like the Arecibo message, and I told them the Arecibo message was in binary code, and people suggested ultimately I try ternary, base 3. And when I did that, things started to work. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into all of that. It's on the earlier videotapes. What I found is that there were certain symmetries natural to the sequence to the alphabet when you did that. You count the letters out in base 3, and then you compare letters that have symmetrical numbers in base 3, which turns out, if you interpret them as Cartesian coordinates, to put the letters in symmetrical positions on a 3 by 3 by 3 cube, similar to a Rubik cube, except there's really a cubie in the middle. There's 27 letters in the full long alphabet, and they each lay out on the cube. The aleph is at the origin, and the final sadi, the last letter, is at the far diagonal. And letters across the main diagonal of the cube have symmetrical positions and symmetrical base 3 counts, so you can associate them. Also, there's an older 22-letter alphabet, which is said to have front-back symmetry. The last letter in that alphabet is a T, so the A compares to the T and the B compares to the S, and that's called Atbash, which is an acronym for ATBS in Hebrew. I made use of both the symmetries of the model that I was working with and of this traditional symmetry system, and that naturally grouped the letters into clusters. This is all up on the website, so people can get that. And then when I did that, I was able to pair off all the letters at the beginning of the first verse of Genesis. By pair off, I mean very simply what you do to make a little paper model. You put tab A in slot A and tab B in slot B. I wrote the letters out, one letter each on a bead chain, but left them so they could move around, but stay in the same order. Curled the bead chain up until the letters paired off, either the same letter with itself or letters that were in symmetrical positions on the cube. And all the letters were accounted for, and they were all presented in the same order, in pairs. There was a letter on one side of the cube, then it was repeated, then the letter on the other side of the cube, and then the first letter again. A, B, A. And the same for all the pairs that existed in the first verse. I checked the text to see if the patterning was just in the first verse or whether it continued, because I didn't want to waste my time. If there was just a pattern in the first verse, who cared? Anybody could make a simple pattern out of 28 letters. And not only that, it could be coincidence. So I did some quick statistical tests and found some anomalies where I expected to find them. In other words, I predicted an anomaly and then found it. And that's important, because if I just went fishing, it wouldn't mean as much. And I also played the text out musically to assure myself that the patterning continued. And to my ear, even allowing for the fact that God's name repeats all the time, you get some very interesting sounds. I think we'll play the tape, at least in part, at a break point, perhaps, when we have getting into this a little more. So I'd assured myself the patterns continue. This is before the statisticians did the Bible code statistics, so nobody knew about this. And I'm looking at the first verse, and I'm pairing off all the letters, and I end up with a form which is basically a spiral vortex sitting on a torus. Now, there's a wonderful book by Arthur Young called The Reflexive Universe, which goes into the meaning of mapping the 7 color map on a torus in a very symmetrical way. And I'm not going to repeat that here either. But the problem was, I had this pattern from the first verse, and that didn't mean anything either. If you stare at the wallpaper for 10 years, you're going to find the pattern. In fact, most wallpaper is patterned. If you stare at a blank TV screen, you're going to see patterns. Finding a pattern is not hard, particularly if you look long enough. The question is this pattern meaningful? Does it teach you anything? Does it say anything? Is it deliberate? Is it accidental? And eventually I found something I'm going to show you in another way from a different perspective in this talk. I found that the pattern was meaningful, that it ended up producing this little model, which I call the light in the meeting tent, or the tetraflame. It's a tetrahedron, and inside of it is a little vortex. And the tetrahedron is supposed to represent a vessel, and the vortex is supposed to represent a flame, thus the idea of a light in the meeting tent. It's an archetypal form in every culture. You make campfires out of tripods of sticks, and the flame comes up on the tripod. At Delphi, they had a tripod with a serpent entwined around it. Actually, it's a 3-serpent, and that turns out to be the full model. And there, it looks surprisingly like the eternal flame that hangs in front of the altar in synagogues and churches. Looks like the green flame of Islam. It was aesthetically very pleasing. It's a model of perfect symmetry against perfect asymmetry in a specially related way. The tetrahedron is the lowest order volume that has complete symmetry. It's the most compact and simplest. It's the most elegant. And this vortex, and I'll show you how it's formed later, turns out to be completely asymmetrical. And the contrast between symmetry and asymmetry is pretty absolute. And we're going to talk about that because that's where I want to start this lecture. And when you look at the little vortex, the asymmetrical flame, through the symmetries of the tetrahedron, you see outlines that look like all of the Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic letters. Whoa! So the text folds up into a form that generates the letters in which the text is written. Now that's neat. But don't be overly impressed. If I had taken a coat hanger and bent it up with a couple of squiggles and played around with my shadows, I'd have found all the letters in just about any alphabet. It is not hard to find shadows of a squiggly form that look like letters. It's hard to find an explicit, meaningful form that does that. And so it's the fact that that's a meaningful form that counts, not just that you can make shadowgrams that make letters. All right, now I want to back up completely, and I want to start over again. That's sort of the story. And it wasn't over. Let me tell you what's wrong with this. And this is where I left the tape 10 years ago. Now, there are half a dozen lectures I've given since, and so there's been a lot of development, which we'll review. But you know what's wrong with this? It's very nice to say that it makes letters as shadows, but there's no regularity to it. Which way do I look at it? Where's the coordinate system? And I developed a theory that the idea why they did this was so that if you could turn this over in your mind's eye, you could repeat a meditation. So a sequence of letters would be the specs for a dance in the mind. But if you couldn't visualize the thing, didn't know how to hold it, and couldn't turn it over easily, how could you use it? What's the natural viewing position for it? Now, I've got a lot of good answers to that, and we found a coordinate system eventually. But I don't want to go that way this time. The problem stands. What form, and you're going to know the answer because you all have the handouts, but ask yourself, what form can every human being immediately visualize in their own mind's eye? And the answer we're going to find is a hand, or what's in your hand. All right, I want to read a couple of different quotations, and they'll catch up with us. Before I do that, I want to point out a few things on the board. Mostly this guy. This is the letter bet, bait. It's the first letter of the text of Genesis. It's the one translated in the. Its formal meaning is house. But God's not a noun, God's a verb. In Hebrew is a real mode language. That means the primary roots are verbs, not nouns. So it's not a house, it's housing. It's what a house does. Most people don't pay any attention to this. But in fact, if you can check the references, I think even David Bohm mentions this in the Quantum Reality book, which is so wonderful. A bait represents the distinction between inside and outside. And that's going to turn out to be enormously important. Now, the rabbis claim that all of the Torah, all of the Bible, is summarized in the first letter, which is, by the way, written big on the Torah scroll. And then they say, more or less, I'm going to speak freely, that if you can't get it from the first letter, God is very understanding and repeats it in more detail for you in the first word, in the first verse, in the first paragraph, in the first chapter. Well, it's a hierarchical array. And the bigger the chunk you take, the more data you get, the higher the resolution. But the image is always the same. So what's the image? Well, if this theory is right, then the whole story should be in the first letter and in the first word. We may get to the first verse, but I'll try to stick to the beginning here. So we need to find out a little more about what this bait might mean. Let me read you a quotation, which I found very, very helpful. And this was pointed out to me by Professor Lou Kaufman, I believe, a number of years ago. It's a quote from G. Spencer Brown's book called The Laws of Form. Spencer Brown, a topologist, proposes what he calls the mark of distinction that archetypally distinguishes inside from outside as a definition of maximal contrast. Now, we're going to get to it because it's important, and if I don't get to it, you should yell at me. Maximal contrast is what this is all about. There's a paper in the packet called Man Bites Dog. Maximal contrast is anomaly, the thing that attracts our attention the very most. Mathematicians have shown that all of formal logic can be derived from Spencer Brown's mark of distinction. And this is quoted from the book. Quote, "The theme of this book is that a universe comes into being," we're talking about creation here, "when a space is severed or taken apart. The skin of a living organism cuts off an outside from an inside. So does the circumference of a circle in a plane." Squaring the circle, maybe. "By tracing the way we represent such a severance, we can begin to reconstruct with an accuracy and coverage that appear almost uncanny." This is a mathematician speaking. "The basic forms underlying linguistic, mathematical, physical, and biological science, and can begin to see how the familiar laws of our own experience follow inexorably from the original act of severance. Although all forms, and thus all universes, are possible, and any particular form is mutable, it becomes evident that the laws relating such forms are the same in any universe. It's this sameness, the idea that we can find a reality which is independent of how the universe actually appears, that lends such fascination to the study of mathematics." Now notice, he's not talking about the things. They're all different. Religious people would say, don't pay attention to idols. He's talking about relationships. And he's saying that there's a catalog of basic relationships which exist all over, and that there's a basic bottom line set. And he's going to generate some of this with his mark of distinction. And it's a book that is worth trying to read. I don't know if you can get through it easily, but it's certainly worth as far as you can get. Well, that's what this is all about. This bait represents that mark of distinction, I'm going to claim, and that it distinguishes inside from outside. And it is related to the idea of a skin, because in the Talmudic tradition, the understanding of who a righteous person is, a person of integrity, it's a person whose insides are like their outsides, toko kavaro. That's the kind of person who would be a saint or tzaddik, that could perhaps do a very high meditation. And if a person's insides and outsides are actually the same, then they metaphorically have no skin. There's no need for one. And of course, that's an ego death situation. They're dissolved into the whatever. There's no distinction. There's no ego embodiment. So let's look at, this is the first word of Genesis. Let's look at the first word of Genesis. It's supposed to contain the whole secret. It's supposed to be able to repeat this bait, this basic idea in more detail. So here's the bait, which means in or in the. And then we have this word reshis, which is said to mean at the head of, because the word resh means head. Well, there's another root in here, which is not usually discussed, and that's this root, reshet. Reshet is a woven net, or network. And I'm going to say that the reason the academic statisticians have found letters skip patterns in the Hebrew Bible is because it's a woven document like a Navajo rug with stripes. And if you unravel it, you get skip patterns on the thread, because that's what the stripes leave. And I'm going to say that that's the kind of coding that was done in the ancient world, and hopefully we'll get to that. So the first thing we're told is in or with a net, or some kind of network, or something of that sort. But there's other words here. The word resh aleph, actually aleph resh, refers to light, so we'll leave that. But esh aleph shin is the word for fire. And shin yud tav, S-I-T, is the word that means either six or thorn. And if you combine those two, you can easily see that a sixth thorn is what we'd call a tetrahedron. It's got 6 edges, and they're prickly. And if you put little sphere points on the tips of them, they turn into a cuboctahedron eventually, which is part of what we'll talk about. And I'm going to say that this first verse that folds itself up to make these kind of vortex patterns, that if you make the vortex the appropriate shape, totally asymmetrical, and that means that certain kinds of spirals are excluded. Logarithmic spirals are self-similar. They're too symmetrical, so they can't be part of this. That this is like a flame. This is like consciousness. This is fire. This is the light. And if we put the Aish in the sheath, the light in the tent, we get the light in the meeting tent, which I derived from a totally different way 10 years ago, when I couldn't analyze the word because I didn't know enough. And I'm going to say, as you go through the rest of the first verse, where it says God created the heaven and the earth, I'm going to say that the earth is like a tetrahedron, the 4 corners of the earth, 4 corners, and that heaven is like an expanse, the flame. And so that the first verse unfurls in the same manner, but in more detail. And we can go into those words, but we're not going to do that now, at least not in this part of the talk. So what we have here is a text that's been translated to give a fairy tale story about creation, which some people take literally, which has a very deep and long tradition that turns out to actually be meaningful, literally meaningful. But what's literal is the geometric metaphor, not the story. Let's hypothesize what is now called the Dirac delta function. An infinite pulse has no duration in time, has absolute maximum infinite amplitude compared to anything else in the universe. If we were to run that through a wave analyzer to find its spectrum, if we were to take a Fourier transform of that Dirac delta function, we'd find a sea of all wavelengths, all possible frequencies at unit amplitude. And obviously, compared to this unit amplitude sea of everything, which is eternal, otherwise the pulse is broadened, against this background, this is the highest possible contrast. Now I'm going to suggest, and this is a paper on the website called The God of Abraham, A Mathematician's View, that what Abraham did is not discover the one God, like they tell you in school. Everybody already knew about the one God. In fact, they knew about too many one gods, People worship the mountains and the sky and the sun and whatever else you might point out. And also people had an internal spiritual experience in meditation of the single light in the mind. What Abraham discovered was that you could set the two equal. You could define God as both singularity and wholeness. That the four-letter name of God refers to singularity. That name is based and pronounced now on a root meaning pedestal. A lord sits high above you on a pedestal. He's a bright light on a high pedestal. Tetrahedron is a pedestal. The four-letter name is compared to the tetragrammaton. Is the tetragrammaton. It's compared to the tetractys, the pattern of 10 dots that had spiritual connotations to the Greeks. That's a little triangle. And if you pile up spheres, it turns out to make a little tetrahedron. I'm only showing 4 of them there. It's a pedestal. The name means pedestal. The 5-letter name of God, the one that comes a little later in the first sentence, Elohim, it's pronounced with an H, but I'll say it with a K so as not to use the name. That ends in the Hebrew ending Yud Mem, Im, Elohim, Im, Yam. Yam means sea. If you look in a dictionary, Yud, final Mem, means sea. It's a great expanse, like a flame. In fact, what you can say, let's see if I put it up here yet. Yes, that an expanse is like an angular sweep all around, just like all these frequencies from the beginning to the end of time, all there is. And this Dirac delta function is like an extent. It's a stretch. There's one of these, and there's many of those. This one's in the mind. This is the world. If you combine the two, you get the Abrahamic definition of God. The credo of Judaism in the Torah is the statement which is said in prayers every day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, that's the 4-letter name. Our God, that's the 5-letter name. The Lord is one. They actually repeat the word Lord, and that's a variation that I don't want to get into, but it fits nicely also. They're basically saying, set Lord and God together equal to unity. Haven't we heard something about that before? Isn't there something in quantum mechanics about delta V, delta S equals, is it H bar or something? Maybe I got that wrong. Isn't that complementarity? Yeah. That's neat. Well, in our case, what we're going to look at, I'll fit it here someplace, is R theta equals 1. R being the 4-letter name, theta being the 5-letter name. Geometric metaphors for them. And that produces a curve, a spiral. And that spiral is known as, this is y equals 1, as, I didn't do it very well, the reciprocal spiral, the hyperbolic spiral. It's the one that shows up under the Eye of Horus. It's the one that shows up in the Book of Kells gratuitously in the drawing of every single one of those animals and other icons in the Book of Kells. It's the one that shows up on the top of Ionic columns. You know, you make a Greek column, and it's got this thing around the top, right? Well, it's this. It's if you use the actual form with the second name, with the 4-letter name got repeated, you get R squared theta. Then you get what is known as the Lydius, which does the same thing except it's asymptotic to the origin. In other words, it sags down because of the square term. This becomes, of course, the Christian shepherd's crook. There's a lot of other things we could say about that spiral, but the most important thing about it is that it's the most asymmetrical spiral you can make, because it's a combination of the two possible lines you can have, the two most different possible lines, a straight line and a curved line. And so you get the most asymmetrical spiral to compare to the most symmetrical vessel. You put the light in the meeting tent. You put the 5-letter name in the 4-letter name. And I'm going to suggest that this is a very modern model. I'm saying that asymmetry and symmetry can be compared to unity and diversity, the light in the meeting tent, the one and the many, wave and particle, flame and coal, radius and circumference, yang and yin, seed and fruit, sun and sky, Big Bang and continuous creation, male and female, direct delta function, and all there is. Consciousness and physics, mind and matter, all of those things. All the same complements that are used as analogs for modern wave-particle duality. That this is a wonderful model of everything. By definition, this isn't a jealous God of a petty people who says, my God's bigger and better than your God because it's my God, and it's the one God because I say so. That's not what we're saying here. I'm saying we are starting with a definition of singularity and wholeness. Definitions are not the basis of prejudice. It's a postulate. I'm putting it down to see how good it is. Does it give us anything? And if we look for the means of spanning between the one and the many, we have a path that includes everything in the universe. Now, modern physics attempts a bottom-up reconstruction. Take all the diversity we find, all the forces in the world, and pump the energy up until things merge together, and eventually we can extrapolate and find the Big Bang, the one from the many. And I'm saying we can do this abstractly. We can do this topologically in principle without any electron microscopes and cyclotrons and supercomputers. We can start top-down by definition, start with a singularity, break it up by minimal first distinction, and end up with all there is. And it's my guess, and this is still a guess, that one way or another, in an extraordinarily elegant way, perhaps the most elegant possible, that's what the sequence of letters in the Hebrew Bible really represents. Now, how can there be a story on top of it? Well, Hebrew doesn't come with vowels, and it doesn't come originally with the letters broken up into words. According to rabbinic tradition, this was in the Jerusalem Post about 15 years ago, according to Rabbi Pinchas Pelly, there are over 900 acceptable translations to the first verse alone. So there's, depending on how you divide up the letters into words, there's plenty of room to tell the story you want to tell. There's plenty of room for the translations. Now, if you had a formal language, we'll talk about this as a formal language, that enabled you to record something very important, like a particular meditation that led to an ego death and rebirth experience in a safe way, and other things besides, and you had to store that someplace, you'd have to put a story on top of it. Because the first thing that happens in bad times is they kill all the priests and the kings and the teachers. It's only the peasants that survive. So you have to give it meaning to people who don't have access to the deepest levels. What better to do than to put the cultural history of that people as the clear text? So they'll have allegiance to it, so they'll want to remember it. What better to do than to use known true history as best as you can know it and tell it? Why lie? Who's going to keep your text if you lie? If everybody knows you made it up. No, you picked stories already known to be true. That's why the Hebrew Bible recapitulates stories that we know come from Sumer or Akkad or other places and other cultures. They were just trying to tell the truth as a history book. But the history book's the clear text, arranged to be the history book, because what's underneath needed to be preserved. I'm saying that underneath the story could be a science of consciousness, a meditational set of exercises and tools to go along with the exercises that enable an individual to have an ego death and rebirth experience, an enlightenment experience, a peak experience that's integrative, that's healthy, healing, that is as modern as it is ancient. And by the way, if we're looking at unifying things like symmetry and asymmetry of highest contrast, then of course, if this model is what it claims to be, it's not just a spatial model, it's a temporal model. It's intended to unify the past and the present and the future, too. There's a lot more to come. I want to get through with one little section of this first, though. So if we try to make the most asymmetrical spiral possible, we discover that the one specified by the Credo of Judaism is the one to use. And if we bring it up into 3 dimensions, as I'm going to show you how to do in a moment, we end up with this little spiral. And when we look at it from different directions, we find all the letters of the Western sacred alphabets. And now with this understanding, all of a sudden the word sacred's not just a vanity. That's just not my saying, my language is sacred because I'm bigger and better than you, and it's my language, therefore it's sacred. No, this is actually a meaningful designation. It's sacred because you can use it to read and write meditations. And it's sacred because you can use it as a base space to specify any quantum state vector. Now, they didn't have quantum mechanics, but they could have understood what I just said, and maybe we'll get to that part too. And it's also sacred because it becomes the basis of a natural universal language. And I'm saying that what we've discovered here, or what I'm about to tell you, is the pre-Tower of Babel universal language alluded to in the Bible. That it's not mysterious or miraculous, it's obvious. And so I'm sitting there and I'm putting this strap on my arm, which is how you bind the case on. Now, the thing about tefillin in the prayer is it follows immediately after the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's what follows naturally from that point. You put your hand over your eye, and you say the Shema, and then you read it, and you've got the tefillin on, and when the tefillin is on, you wrap it on your hand, the strap, and on your hand, you're supposed to see like the letter Shin, the letter Dalet, and the letter Yud in your hand in the strap, in your hand in the strap. Oh, my God. Instant karma. Drop my ego defenses, and bingo. The little flame model is a model hand. It's a model hand. It's a 1/3 chunk of this apple, of these torus models, which if we get a chance we'll talk about, but they're on most of the other tapes. It's a hand. And you know what about a hand? Like I was saying before we started the tape, you can always see your hand in your mind's eye. You can always see what's in your hand in your mind's eye. You can reach behind you. You can tell a salt shaker from an apple from the fork. Most people can. If you haven't had too much to drink, the traffic cop is not going to have you can do this. You know where your nose is. I don't have to have my eyes open. So when you put this is a thicker model. It's easier to see from the smaller models. These are finger width, those are hand width. It's the same idea. The edge of the curve is the same shape. It just spread more. When you put the flame in your hands, oh, and by the way, where's the tetrahedron? Anybody ever see the opening move? 2 fists and 2 elbows, the corners of the tetrahedron. You put it in your hand, you can immediately see it in your mind's eye. It takes a few minutes practice. When you make different gestures with your own hands, you see different outlines, different shadows of the same model. In fact, you can see all the Hebrew letters. And you know what? Each Hebrew letter has a name. And the name of the letter Pei, its name means mouth. And you see it when you make this gesture. That's the Hebrew letter Pei. Now, you'll see it in my left hand. I'll see it in my right hand. So it's a symmetrical set. This gesture produces the letter Zion. Anybody want to guess what Zion means? How about project? That's not a big secret. If I were to spell Hebrew words using these gestures, well, you tell me what they mean. I'm Christopher Columbus, I tell people, and you're the American Indians. And it says in the diaries that they spoke to the American Indians in Hebrew. And everyone thinks that's crazy except Mormons who believe that American Indians are the lost tribes. How could it be? Well, the crew consisted of escaping Muslims and Jews. They were escaping the Inquisition. 1492 was when the Jews and the Muslims had to convert or be killed or driven out. So the rich guys and the educated guys joined Columbus's crew and set off. Why stay home? It's going to be bad. So they knew, if I'm right, these gestures. The letter shapes I get match the handwriting that was used in Islamic Spain. Rashi Maimonides is what it's called. And if I'm Christopher Columbus and I ask you to get me something like this, would someone like to say what kind of thing I want? An adjective, maybe? Something that is... Anybody? For the tape, come on. Apple is good. Round? Round's obviously round. Yeah, this is the Hebrew letter Gimel, for those who know Hebrew. And this is the Hebrew letter Lamed, that's the doorbell. Gimel Lamed spells round. That's the root for the word round. If I'm a traffic cop and I do this, everyone knows I mean come towards me. Beit, Aleph, Lamed, Yud means come towards me. Now, not everything's that simple. I'm picking examples that make the point obvious. But I'm saying that the Hebrew and almost certainly the Greek and Arabic letters are based on hand gestures, because hand gestures have natural meaning. And I'm saying that in an abstract space, the 27 letters probably can be shown to correspond meaningfully, in the sense that Arthur Young produces a geometry of meaning from his metaphor, with the 27 lines that solve the general cubic equation, which correspond to a set of 27, well, you can say they're like vectors coming off a hypersphere. They're really not, but it could be related. So that what you have is a hypersphere with a set of basic pointing directions coming off of it. And because there's more symmetry variations in 3 and 4 dimensions than in higher dimensions, whatever is sufficient to navigate by these distinctions in 4 dimensions would be sufficient for any dimensionality. So these 27 little unit vectors that correspond to these meanings of the letters should be sufficient to form a base space for any quantum state vector in Hilbert space. Now, I don't know if that's true, and someone who knows more physics than I do needs to work that out in detail. But it seems highly likely that that's the case, particularly when you consider the possibility that the Abrahamic and the Brahmic traditions are actually related. Because in the Brahmic traditions, we have the Sri Yantra, the mandala of creation, which I pulled out in the 3 dimensions. And it consists of 9 interlaced triangles, which unfurl from a bindu point, a toroidal point, into a hypersphere. And of course, 9 triangles is 27 lines. So I'm saying that this Sri Yantra, which occurs in a allegedly 3D form, although it's usually not shown properly, really is an early way of representing the 27 lines that solve the general cubic. Solve the general cubic equation? Did they know that in the ancient world? Aren't I violating what I said at the beginning? This has to be known in the ancient world, or I can't be right? Well, it turns out that they did know it, or it's likely they knew it. There is evidence on the Rhine papyrus from Egypt, which is the oldest mathematical document we have, I think, of their ability to solve simple cubic equations in some special cases. And that's described in a book on Egyptian mathematics. Is it Gillings? Yeah, I don't remember, but if people want it, I can dig up the reference on that. It turns out that in order to make calendars, you need to know certain things. And they made calendars, and we don't know exactly what their formalisms were, but they did work out some of these things in special cases, so they could have understood this. There's also a more direct way to get to it, which I'm not going to show tonight. The same with this reciprocal spiral, which shows up under the Eye of Horus. Reciprocal spiral means it's based on 1 over everything. Well, Egyptian fractions were all 1 over. And so this is the spiral that you get from the table of Egyptian fractions, which is very nice. And as I said earlier, it can't be a logarithmic spiral because a log spiral is too self-similar. And that includes the golden spiral. It can't be. It can't be an Archimedean spiral because it also has too much symmetry, although it's a cruder form. It has to be this spiral. And if you examine this spiral very carefully, you find that it shows up in many different places, some of them very unexpected. It's the archetypal wind-up and pitch of David and Goliath. It's the flight path of a bird of prey from a tree in an oasis in a desert out to the horizon where it dives on its prey. bird of prey lofts itself on the air currents. And so it spirals up and then dives. And that's the same archetype. But as I said, and that's a process. And all the words in Hebrew that describe a bird of prey doing that, including the word for desert and the word for the vortex and the word for the bird itself and the word for the horizon, are all spelled with exactly the same letters, ayin, resh, beit. The great I don't know if he was a physicist, physicist, Dirac, proposed an explanation for the reason that fermions, like particles like electrons, have spin of a half. It takes 2 times around for them to come back to the same location, same direction. He said that this was due to something which came to be called the Dirac string trick, which Dirac himself compared to the plate trick or the Philippine wine dance. Philippine wine dance is also known in the Middle East as the flame dance. You put a candle in your palm, and obviously you don't want to tip it over. You put a glass of wine in your palm, and obviously you don't want to tip it over. And the idea is that you want to go around continuously in the same direction by going above and below your shoulder. And no, I won't do it with a glass of water. That would be foolish. Well, this is the Philippine wine dance. Well, we've all seen the Cleopatra drawings. It's not hard to believe that that's part of the same idea. And we, of course, know about Sufi dances and Middle Eastern dances, and this is a kind of universal thing. Most cultures have it. If you were to actually look at the path of the dance, I'm saying that this is the orbit of the dance. Well, the Kabbalah says, this book of formation, which no one can make sense of, says, put 5 against 5. And everyone knows the 5 means a hand. And 5 against 5 would, of course, be like this. It's simply 2 of the hand models, a left and a right hand. That's the orbit of the dance. And, of course, the Dirac string trick, I've got a lot of stuff here. What the Dirac string trick says is that you have an outer sphere and an inner sphere, and they're connected by a ribbon, which I probably can't draw very well, and that if you curl up the ribbon, I don't know if I can do it, give it 2 turns, and if it's stretchy, what you can do is unstretch it by flopping it underneath and pulling it around, and then it straightens out. And that's why, as you go around, you do and undo the same curve. You're connecting an in sphere to an out sphere. The 11th verse of Genesis says, God created a fruit tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself. This is a fruit, and this is the womb or the seed. It's a big apple. No, it's not New York City. It's a big apple. It's a big apple. I'm taking a chunk out of this apple. I'm pulling a serpent out of the apple. On the earth plane, which is the equatorial plane of the apple, otherwise known as Eden. And of course, I've got 12 fingers on the circle because I've got 3 hands in my model that comes from Genesis, and we're going to not talk about that in detail. So I've got 12 fingers on the circle, on the edge of the earth plane, 12 houses, 12 knights, 12 apostles, 12 tribes, all the 12 round ones. And I've got an upper and a lower, and they rub against each other, against a threshing floor, where I can put grain down the middle. Hamlet's mill. And in this apple, in the middle of the apple, of course, I have the seed. And then if I'm going to map the life cycle of the fruit tree onto its own fruit tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself, well, if that's the seed, the golden seed in the middle, then this is the tree, and this is the fruit. A natural module of a living system. And I can also map the stages of the whole alphabet onto this, but we're not going to do that tonight. Now, I think I actually have the quote here. They tell us in the Bible not only that the Torah is a tree of life for those who grasp it, grasp, hold in the hands, tree of life, recursive hierarchy, but they also tell us, if I can find it, I should redo that quote anyway. Moses said, this is appointing the architects to build the tabernacle. Moses said to the Israelites, God has selected Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, the tribe of Judah, and has filled them with the divine spirit of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and talent for all types of craftsmanship. He will thus be able to devise plans and work in gold, silver, and copper, and etc. Also will eventually be able to brocade, embroider, and weave. So I'm saying that it's not that the Torah is in the tabernacle or in the ark, is that the ark is in the Torah, woven in. And I'm saying that this is the golden point, gold and silver and brass. The star, the sun, the prophet, the temple mount, the seed. And this part, the part in the palm of the hand, is the silver part. The Hebrew word for silver is the word for money, kesef, kaf saf. Kaf means palm, and saf is the Ein Sof, the Sophia, the Sufi, the whole model. Hold. And the word for copper or brass and the word for serpent is the same. So this is the snaky part, this is the copper. And together they form the whole system. This is from The Origin of Letters and Numerals according to the Sefer Yetzirah by Phineas Mordell, 1914. It's available from Sam Weiser, copyright 75. The references are there. We must conclude that the so-called Arabic numerals and the alphabet originated from the 10 digits and the 0, or rather from two symbols, 1 and 0, the stroke and the circle. Nelm, in his essay on the origin of letters, shows that all elementary characters or letters derive their forms from line and circle. As I understand the Sefer Yetzirah, it also holds that all written characters originated from a line and a circle, but from a line that was originally a symbol for unity and a circle that was originally a symbol for 0. Well, he's wrong. It's actually wholeness. Similarly, well, we don't have to go on. Look, anybody reading that, any literate person, would say, gee, gosh whiz, that's pretty obvious. All the letters are made up of straight lines and arcs. And leave it at that. Isn't that the natural, obvious meaning of the quote? A line and a circle. You look at letters, they have straight parts and they have curved parts. It isn't as if they didn't write it down. It's that the people doing the interpreting and translating for us didn't notice or look for or think there ought to be a deeper meaning. And they didn't look for a deeper meaning because they presumed that the folks from the ancient world weren't very bright or knowledgeable. They were simple enough to think that that was an important statement, not an obvious statement. And I'm saying the solution is much nicer. The reason for posing the riddle wasn't because the Greeks didn't know you couldn't square the circle with a straight edge and a compass. It's because they did know that you couldn't do it geometrically, but that thinking about it philosophically recorded the fact that universal language is hand gesture language. Because when you take your circle and your line and you curl them up rather tightly, curl up the circle. If you've cut it out, you can do this. And you have to over-curl it so when it snaps back, it holds its shape. And if you bend up the line, voila. Now, I made some prettier ones earlier. And we only have a couple more of these kits around. And of course, they've unsprung themselves a little in transit, but they're not bad. That's the answer to the riddle. It's a model hand that generates the sacred letters of the Western alphabets that you need if you're going to learn the meditation or make use of them for their cosmological models. It's as simple as that. This is the same model as this is. It's a little bigger, I think. It's got approximately 1.5 turns. You know you made it right when it comes to about the same level and the two are approximately parallel. And you can make various gestures that make the letters with it. So cut it out carefully and cut it out from the side with the sharp design so you get the right outline. And bend it gently so it doesn't crimp. And you'll be able to make a pair of hands. And I'm saying that this is the solution to squaring the circle and reconciling the idea of the one and the many. And as a model of the 4-letter name of God and the 5-letter name of God. I've got lots more detail here. We can go into the symmetry groups and the torus knots. I can show you why tetrahedra and toruses go together. We can unfurl some of the forms. They didn't need any of the formal geometry. You could do it by stacking oranges in the agora. You know how you stack fruit in the marketplace? Well, that's cuboctahedral sphere packing. It turns out that cuboctahedral sphere packs can be used to lay out the same forms, the same vortex forms, very elegantly. If you didn't get the curve from what I just said, and you happen to worship the sun god, Helios, sun in the center of the earth, plane, going around, all that stuff, Plato's cave, Helios, the sun god. Well, it's very convenient. If you take a sundial and you mark a spot at the same time every day, that's the curve you get. Helios draws his own curve, experimentally, to a person who would have common knowledge of how to make a sundial in the ancient world. No analytic forms required. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to shape the cone to get the right kind of vortex. Well, if you assemble 6 of these hand models, obviously I made the wrong hand in this. Let's take the other one. 6 of the same kind. These are identical. Now, I could put the rest of the fingers in and you'd have a full basket. And if you were to lay out the letter skip patterns, you write the Torah on this, the letter skip patterns would form concentric bands, just like stripes on a Navajo rug. So they didn't have to do any heavy-duty math to code the text. Coding it was simply a matter of looking at it, to checking it anyway. Another interesting point is, you know how they wrote codes in the ancient world, kept secret codes, one of the most common ways? General A would send a message to General B by taking a strap and winding it on a pole and writing across the windings. And if General B knew the diameter of the pole, and General A only sent the limp strap with a lot of miscellaneous stuff filled in, the only way you could read the message was to wind it on the same pole, and the second general would get the message. Well, that's how you see the patterning in the first verse of Genesis. These are the symmetry groups, showing the letters A, A, B, A, as I told you early on. A, A, B, A, A, B, A. So that this was a form of coding that was known in the ancient world and used. But they didn't wind it up just on a straight pole. I think they wound it on this special scepter. Dorj comes to mind in the Eastern traditions. This Kiddush cup, after all, if it had all these spheres packed in it, they'd be like grapes. So we have our wine cup. We have our Grail cup. Yes, it comes with Excalibur right inside of it. See? Its center column is Excalibur. And if you pull this out and flip it around, you get the Levite sword dance. Very similar to some Sufi dances in modern sword dancing, which I'm not going to demonstrate. And the unit turn of this column, this is 1/3 unit turn, has exactly enough room for 1 letter each of the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet. And turning it inside out into this 3D form leaves room for the other 5 final letters for the 27-letter alphabet. So they intertransform like a gluon and an event in superstring theory. Now, did they know superstring theory? Absolutely not. Did they know this basic topology from braiding challahs for the Sabbath and milking cows? Yes, they did. And they could have checked it in meditation instead of at the cyclotron. So they had a way to test it. And they had an experimental science based on musical harmonies, which parallel the geometries. And if you're into the music, I highly recommend the work of Ernest G. McLean, who's a former chair of music at Brooklyn College, now retired, who's written several really brilliant books showing tonal mandalas that are associated with Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic texts, and Eastern Vedic material as well. Brilliant material. These are 16 carpet pages from the Leningrad Codex, which is the oldest Hebrew Bible in existence. It's 1,000 years old. It was taken from Cairo, and it ended up at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Long story. You will notice that they are highly geometric. In fact, those who know some physics will recognize the Baronian rings, which invert to produce hyperbolic space. You'll also notice various torus knots and pre-Kabbalistic drawings. And of course, the academic scholars treat this as nothing but artistic embellishment and have never even looked at this. Sitting there in front of them, and they've never even thought it was anything other than artistry. So I would suggest there's a lot more to do to find out what all that means. This turns out to be the 3/8 torus knot, which is directly related to, this is a 3/10 torus knot, very, very close. The torus knots, by the way, are associated mathematically with the Platonic solids and the symmetry groups that relate to them. So that this actually has modern formal meaning too. Is that what you were thinking about? Yeah. Maybe I should play the music unless there's somebody with an aching question. There's more on the website. We have some videos of the earlier talks. Meru has no ongoing funding, so we accept contributions. If you need a tax deduction, we are legit. You can get one. Go to the website.
And why are you really doing all this?
Excuse me?
Your wife said, why are you really doing all this?
Well, I'm doing it because I asked God if there was anything I could do to help, and He dropped this on me, and I couldn't walk away from it. And because I believe, thank you for refocusing the question, I appreciate that. I don't think that this is a panacea. This doesn't in itself solve problems or make us love each other or care about each other. But you can't solve a problem unless you have a model, an ideal, a sense of where you're going. This infinite anomaly, I erased it, is the ultimate focal point. It's a common definition that doesn't offend anybody, that can enable us to stretch between singularity and wholeness. And so I see it as an ecological principle that's a vital part of planetary ecology, and that if it becomes known and appreciated, will inspire the populations to act on it. Just like we believe the law of gravity, it's about time we took the golden rule as a rule of nature and not just an empty admonition. And this demonstrates it might well be.